She thought he was dead. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Dead in the most brutal, physical way, swallowed whole by snow, limbs frozen beneath 20 feet of silence. For 4 years, Sheriff Rachel Morgan had walked with that loss buried deep in her ribs, like ice that never melted. And now, there he was, in the middle of a soaked forest, on a forgotten trail outside Cedar Falls. He stood in the storm. His coat matted, trembling, tied to a shattered pine tree with what looked like fraying paracord. One cloudy eye blinked through the rain. The other, amber and razor-sharp, locked on hers. She didn't move. Couldn't. Her boot was half sunken in the mud, her shoulders frozen under the weight of disbelief. She stared into that one good eye and felt every wall inside her crack. Diesel. His name left her mouth in a whisper, softer than the wind in the trees. He didn't bark, didn't move. Just stood there, silent and soaked, ribs showing beneath the filth, his chest rising in slow, laboured rhythm. The rain streamed off his muzzle, collecting in drops on the end of his nose. She knew that scar above his left brow, white, arcing, a signature, a wound she had memorised and mourned. Rachel stepped forward, her sidearm pressing into her hip as she slowly lowered herself to one knee. "Hey, boy," she murmured. "It's okay." He tilted his head, one twitch of an ear. And then his tail moved. Barely. A slow, uncertain wag. Her arms opened before her brain could catch up. "Come here." He limped toward her, each step deliberate, painful, but determined. And then his head pressed into her chest like nothing had changed, like he'd never left. Like the storm, the snow, the silence had never stolen 4 years from both of them. She buried her face in the wet fur on the crown of his head, letting the memories crush her. "You found me," she whispered. "You actually found me." She wrapped him in a blanket from the trunk and lifted him into the back seat of the cruiser. He curled up the moment the door closed, like his body remembered the motion. As she pulled away from the trailhead, the wipers screeched across the windshield in rhythmic pulses. Her heart refused to settle. Back in town, nothing had changed. The diner lights blinked through the rain. The gas station buzzed in flickers. 2 kids biked through puddles like the world hadn't just cracked open. Rachel parked behind the sheriff's department. No one saw her carry him inside. She laid him gently on a towel beside her desk. His spot, his space. He didn't make a sound. He just watched the door, like always. Rachel sat in her chair. The low hum of the building, the faint scent of wet dog fur. The brass nameplate on her desk still read Sheriff R. Morgan, but it felt foreign, borrowed. She stared at him. 4 years of silence, broken by a glance. The last time she saw Diesel had been on a Colorado mountainside, powder blanketing everything. Their K9 team had been tracking 2 lost hikers. The snow was deep. Diesel had picked up a trail, pushing through drifts nearly up to his chest. Then the avalanche. It didn't sound like anything. It sounded like everything. The sky collapsed. The mountain roared. She saw half her team disappear in a wave of white. And Diesel, running towards something only he could smell, swallowed whole. They found some bodies. Not all. Not him. Rachel had screamed his name until her throat bled. She never found his body. She never stopped listening. The front door creaked. Deputy Frank Alton stepped inside, rain clinging to the shoulders of his jacket. Broad frame, mid-50s, gruff, observant, dependable. He paused mid-step when he saw Diesel on the floor. "Is that?" Rachel just nodded. "Yeah, it's him." Frank knelt down. His knees popped. Diesel sniffed the air, then pressed his head lightly into Frank's hand. "I'll be damned," Frank breathed, thought he was buried with the others. "So did I." They didn't speak after that. Just watched Diesel breathe, real, tangible, impossible. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. "Hikers reported more snares," he said. "Near Brush Creek. Barbed wire, old but tight. Clean enough to snap a deer's leg." Rachel opened the folder. Photos, jagged wire twisted around tree trunks. Crude but deliberate. Placed too close to trails. Sloppy or bold, or both. "Same type we found back in '09, Frank said. "Could be teenagers," Rachel said, not believing it. "Could be worse." Diesel shifted under the desk. His ears twitched. Rachel leaned back. "I'll check it tomorrow morning. You want backup? I'll take Diesel." Frank gave her a look. "That dog's retired." She looked down. Diesel's eyes were still locked on the door. "You think he ever clocked out?" The snow had come fast that day, 4 years ago, and left faster. but the silence it buried her in had never left. Rachel still remembered the crunch of her boots through the early drifts, the damp breath of Diesel at her side, his nose twitching with purpose. They'd been tracking a scent, 2 missing hikers lost near the summit of Pike's Hollow. Diesel had been sharp, relentless, even as the wind picked up and the snow thickened. She'd trusted him more than the map in her hand, and then everything collapsed. It started with a rumble, subtle at first like the growl of a far-off engine, but the mountain knew what it was. Diesel did too. He'd stopped, ears flattened, eyes wide. Rachel shouted his name and he turned once to look at her, then sprinted ahead. She never saw him again. The avalanche swept down with a roar that drowned out every thought, every breath. It buried the radio signals, the trails, the bodies. When the storm passed and the snow hardened like glass, all she could do was scream his name. She never told anyone how long she screamed, long after her voice had gone raw. They found remnants, gear, packs, a boot, a broken locator beacon. Not Diesel. Back then, Cedar Falls hadn't known how to help her. Grief wasn't a thing she allowed space for in the department. She buried it like they buried the mission report, marked incomplete and filed away. But now, Diesel was asleep beside her desk, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, ribs still too visible. A ghost made of fur and memory. She barely slept that night. The low hum of the station, the sound of Diesel's slow breathing, too steady, too familiar. Her patrol vest hung by the door, untouched. She hadn't told a soul he was back. Not even Frank knew the whole truth. She sat with her journal open, fingers idle, eyes watching the rise and fall of Diesel's chest. She wanted to ask him where he'd been, who had tied him to that tree. Why now? But dogs don't tell stories, they just carry them. Somewhere outside, something creaked. A shift in wind, the old back door hinge. Diesel stirred, ears lifting, body still. Rachel felt it too, a change in the air. He growled. Not a bark, not a whimper, a deep old sound, caution and warning braided together. Rachel stood, hand resting on her sidearm. "Stay," she whispered. She moved into the hallway, boots quiet on the rubber matting. The door to the records room was ajar. She had locked it earlier. Her fingers brushed the holster clip as she pushed the door open. Inside, movement. A shape lunged. She ducked, pivoted, brought the weight of her shoulder into the figure and slammed him into the file cabinets. The man scrambled, tried to run. He didn't get far. Diesel was already there. Teeth bared, body between the intruder and the exit. The man froze. Rachel tackled him. In one swift motion, she cuffed his wrists and kicked his pack aside. Frank arrived minutes later, rain soaking his collar. Together they opened the bag, wire cutters, bolt fasteners, a trail map with crude red X's. Diesel stood in the doorway, watching, breathing heavy, tail still. Rachel stared at him. Something had settled in her chest, a tightness she hadn't noticed before. And now it eased. She wasn't alone. That night, rain turned to mist. Diesel curled beneath her desk like he'd never left. Rachel flipped to a blank page in her journal and wrote slowly, "Sometimes the ones we lose come back, and sometimes they bring us with them." The morning arrived wrapped in fog, soft and slow. The town outside yawned to life, puddles on sidewalks, steam curling from diner windows. The trees glistened with dew. Rachel stood by the window, mug in hand. Her shoulder ached from the scuffle. Her mind still echoed with last night's adrenaline. Behind her, Diesel hadn't moved much, just enough to shift pressure off his bad leg. His eye followed every sound. Frank arrived with breakfast. McDonald's, like always. He dropped the bag and grunted. "You sleep?" Rachel shook her head. "Didn't think he did either," Frank said, nodding toward Diesel. They ate in silence, the rustle of wrappers the only sound. Then Frank slid another folder across the desk. Trail crew found more traps. Miller's Bluff this time. Same setup, rusted wire. But these weren't hidden. They were practically on the trail. Rachel's jaw tightened as she flipped through the photos. Tight loops, improvised but dangerous. Careless or confident. "We need to sweep that area," Frank said, quietly. "No alerts. Last thing we need is hikers panicking. I'll head up this afternoon. I'll send a deputy." "I don't need one." Frank looked at her. Long pause. Then, "You taking him?" Rachel didn't answer. She didn't have to. The road to Miller's Bluff wound through narrow passes, the shoulder crumbling from last winter's storms. Rachel parked at the forestry gate. Diesel hopped down stiffly but steady. The scent of pine and wet earth filled the air. She adjusted the strap on her field bag, checked her weapon, looked down. You ready?" Diesel didn't wag. He didn't need to. They started walking. Half an hour in, they passed an old hunter's blind, collapsed into the creek bed. Rachel moved quietly. Diesel stayed just ahead, nose down, ears rotating. Then he stopped. Ears up, head turned. Rachel followed his gaze. At first, nothing. Then, through the brush, tire tracks, narrow, not from patrol. They curved through a clearing and disappeared behind a ridge. She crouched, ran her fingers through the fresh mud. "Less than a day old," she whispered. Diesel sniffed the air and moved forward. They followed. Through thorns and tangled branches up the ridge, and there it was. A pickup truck, old, grey, no plates. The bed covered by a faded military-style tarp weighed down with stones. Rachel's breath caught. Everything about it was wrong. She reached for her mic. A crack. Loud. Sharp. Something struck her temple. Hard. Blinding. She collapsed. Darkness came before the ground did. The world was sideways when she came to, colours smeared, sounds dull, like she was hearing through cotton and blood. The tang of rust clung to her nose. Her arms burned. Her head pulsed with pain. Rachel blinked hard. Her wrists were tied behind her, tight. She was slumped against a pine trunk, rough bark digging into her shoulder blades. Something crusted on her temple, blood, half-dried. The air smelled like sap and gasoline, and silence. Too much silence. She listened. Footsteps in the distance. Male voices at least two, one higher-pitched, nervous, one low and calm. Not coming toward her. That was something. Her sidearm? Gone. Radio? Gone. Her heart thudded behind her ribs like a hammer in a locked drawer. Military knots. Whoever tied her knew what they were doing. She twisted her fingers, trying to find give in the rope. None. Her wrist screamed in protest. Gritting her teeth, she turned her face to the forest canopy, watching the light flicker through needles. Afternoon, maybe late. If she passed out again, she might not wake up. A single bark split the air. Short, sharp, familiar. Her throat tightened. "Diesel," she whispered. No answer, no second bark. Just wind through the trees. But she knew. He was close. Back in Cedar Falls, 9-year-old Mason Whitaker sat on the edge of his grandmother's porch, kicking his heels against the wooden steps. Every afternoon, Diesel came. He'd appear at the tree line like clockwork, sit for 7 minutes exactly, and wait. Mason always brought him toast crusts. But today? Nothing. He squinted into the woods. "Diesel!" he called. Nothing moved. Clara Whitaker stepped outside, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. She held a small prayer book in one hand. Her voice was firm. "Don't go running, Maze." "I think he's hurt," Mason said. Clara looked to the forest, then to the overcast sky. "No," she murmured. "I think someone else is." Miles away, Diesel stood at the edge of a shallow ravine, nose twitching. He hadn't obeyed Rachel's stay command. Not this time. Something had been wrong, and he knew it. He'd smelled it in the way her breath hitched, in the tang of fear that clung to the mud. He found her trail, layered under the pine needles, rust, oil and blood. He moved. Not fast. His body no longer allowed that, but with certainty. Each limp earned. Every stride driven by instinct older than words. In the clearing, Rachel fought dizziness. Her wrists burned. Her throat was dry. A sound, not from the men, from behind her. She turned her head, vision blurred, and saw him, stepping from the brush like a shadow pulled from the ground. Mud clung to his legs. His limp was worse. But his eyes? Sharp, focused, alive. He sniffed her hand, then moved behind the tree. "Diesel," she choked. "You found me." He didn't bark, didn't whine. He just began to chew. His teeth were dulled with age, but he tore at the rope with a kind of faith that couldn't be trained. Bit by bit, the fibers frayed. Each pull was a promise. Rachel held her breath. Minutes dragged. Then a snap, a soft, wet pop. Her arms fell forward, dead weight. The blood rushed back so quickly she cried out. Not in pain, something else. Relief, awe, disbelief. She reached behind her, fingers trembling, and felt the fur of his neck. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." Diesel didn't move. Not yet. He stood beside her, breathing heavy, body close enough for her to lean on. Her legs tingled as circulation returned. Her head throbbed, vision pulsing. The voices were further now, deeper into the woods. She pressed a hand to the trunk, used it to brace herself, tried to rise. Failed. Tried again. Diesel stepped closer, shoulder firm against her thigh, like a cane, like a vow. It wasn't fast, it wasn't graceful, but she got to her feet. Back in town, Deputy Frank Alton paced the ranger station floor, boots caked in dried mud. He stared at the trail maps pinned across the wall. It had been hours, too many. No radio call, no sign of Rachel's cruiser, just fog rolling in from the valley and a silence that stretched too long. Then, rustling at the front door, a note slipped underneath. Written in pencil, lined notebook paper. A drawing, trees, a creek, a ridge, an X scratched between two rocks. At the bottom, Mason. Frank turned the page over. No scale, no landmarks, but something about it sat heavy in his gut. The kid had a connection to that dog, and Diesel had never failed them yet. Frank stuffed the sketch in his jacket, called for backup, and drove. Rachel and Diesel moved slowly. Every few steps she paused to breathe. Every time he waited, silent, patient. The trail was narrow, winding through ferns and fallen branches. She couldn't move fast, but she moved forward. That was enough. Once, she stumbled. Diesel turned sharply, pressed into her hip, held her steady. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of memories, of knowing, of things that didn't need to be spoken. By the time Frank arrived at the trailhead, the sun was low. Dana Ellis, Forest Service enforcement, pulled in behind him, tall, wiry, with a scar tracing her cheekbone. "Nothing at Brush Creek," she said, handing him a notepad, "but found tire tracks at Miller's Bluff. Heavy duty. No plates. Same pattern as that truck we impounded." Frank nodded. She wouldn't have gone there unless she was sure. Dana raised an eyebrow at the kid's map sticking out of his pocket. "You trusting that sketch?" Frank looked toward the woods. "Yeah, I am." Rachel stumbled into a small clearing ringed with birch trees. Her knees gave. She slumped against a log. Diesel moved ahead, sniffing the air circling a patch of moss. He barked. Once, loud, commanding. Rachel lifted her head. A voice, distant. Then the flicker of a flashlight through the trees. She tried to call out. Nothing. She tried again. "Frank." Barely a whisper. Diesel turned. Barked again. Crashing boots, underbrush cracking. Then Frank's voice. "Rachel." She didn't answer. Didn't need to. They found her minutes later, half slumped, bleeding, shaking. Diesel stood beside her, unmoving, her shadow. Dana knelt. Pulse is weak, but she's aware. Frank brushed a leaf from her cheek. Rachel's voice broken. "Don't let him leave." Frank nodded. He's not going anywhere. Word spread fast in Cedar Falls, faster than cell reception ever could. By the time Rachel Morgan was stable in her hospital bed, dehydrated, bruised, stitched up, people already knew. Not the full story, not yet. But enough, that the sheriff was alive, that she'd been found in the forest, that the dog who had once vanished had come back to save her. Diesel never left her side. He curled under her bed, not leashed, not commanded, just present. Whenever a nurse walked in, his ears flicked, eyes narrowed, body tense until he decided they posed no threat. Then he'd rest again, nose on paws, silent guardian. Doctors told her she'd heal. Mild concussion, torn ligaments in her wrist, rope burns that would scar, but nothing life-threatening. She knew better. She'd been one breath away from never seeing daylight again. Frank visited the Wildlife Rehab Center a few days later. In the back room, Dr. Miriam Vaughan was tending to a small bear cub, barely 6 months old, wrapped in flannel and trembling. "Found him chained behind a shack in the woods," she said, brushing dried mud from the cub's muzzle. "Probably bait for something bigger. No food, no water, just left there." Frank's jaw tightened. "We're pressing charges." Miriam nodded, gently cradling the cub. "He's too young to survive alone. We'll keep him here. If he makes it, we'll release him by fall." Back at the sheriff's office, Rachel returned to her desk with an arm in a sling and her head still throbbing. Diesel was already there, curled on the folded blanket like nothing had changed, but everything had. Frank dropped a folder in front of her. "We impounded the truck." No, back in town, the news spread fast. It always did in places like Cedar Falls, where cell service was spotty, but gossip moved quicker than wildfire. By the time Rachel was settled in a hospital bed, Diesel curled on the floor beside her, the whispers had already started. The dog who came back, the sheriff who returned, the story no one could believe because it was too real. Diesel never left her side. He lay beneath her bed, ears twitching only when someone new entered. When the nurses bent to check the IV or change her dressing, he watched them. Not aggressive, just alert. The doctor said she'd be fine. Bruised ribs, mild concussion, rope burns that would leave scars. But she was alive. and they all knew why. Later that week, Frank made a quiet visit to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Centre on the edge of town. The halls smelled of cedar and antiseptic. In the back room, Dr. Miriam Vaughan, grey streaks in her braid, hands steady and soft, was tending to a bear cub wrapped in fleece. The cub was barely 6 months old. One paw was bandaged. Its muzzle showed signs of neglect. "We found him chained behind a shack," Miriam said, voice tight. "Probably used as bait." Frank's face darkened. "Sheriff wants to press charges." "She should," Miriam replied, stroking the cub's ear. "He's too young to survive alone. We'll try to rehab him and release him near Glacier Creek." At the sheriff's department, Rachel sat at her desk, her left arm in a sling, eyes sharp again. Diesel curled beside her chair, one ear flicking lazily as Frank walked in. He handed her a folder. "Truck's been impounded. No plates. Engine shot. But—" He tapped the file. "We found tarp fibres on Diesel's collar. Same kind used to cover the truck bed." Rachel didn't look up. "He led me straight to them." Frank leaned on the desk. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" She nodded slowly. "We need to rebuild the K9 unit." Frank blinked. "We don't have the budget. I'm not asking for 10 dogs, just one." She reached down, resting her hand on Diesel's shoulder. "And I've already got him." A few days later, Rachel stood in front of Cedar Falls Elementary with Diesel at her side. He wore a navy blue bandana, on it a small K9 honor patch sewn in by hand. The library doors opened and a wave of 4th graders spilled out, loud, wide-eyed. Diesel didn't flinch. He stood calmly, as if he'd done this 1,000 times. The kids formed a circle on the carpet, whispering and pointing. Rachel waited until they quieted. Then, kneeling beside Diesel, she began. "I want to tell you a story," she said softly, "about a dog who never stopped listening, who never forgot his job, and who brought someone home when no one else could." She didn't dramatize. She didn't need to. The forest, the traps, the rescue, all of it lived in her voice now. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Mason stepped forward. He pulled a cloth off the easel next to him. Behind it, a poster, hand-drawn, coloured in crayon, showing Rachel and Diesel beneath a pine tree, a sunset streaked in orange behind them. At the bottom, block letters read, "Kindness echoes louder than fear." Rachel knelt beside Diesel and pressed her hand to the space behind his ear. The children clapped, but Diesel didn't move. He didn't need to. He'd already done his part. That night, the storm returned, not with fury, but with presence. Rain fell steadily, the kind that slipped down pine needles and whispered against window panes. Cedar Falls slept, but Diesel didn't. He lay at the foot of Rachel's bed, his eyes open, ears rotating in slow arcs like radar. Every few minutes he lifted his head and listened. No thunder, no lightning, just a quiet tension in the air. It had been 1 week since the bust at Moose Ridge, 1 week since the cubs were rescued, the poachers arrested, and Rachel cleared to return to duty. But the silence now, it felt heavier, like the woods were waiting. At 3:12 a.m., Rachel sat up, one hand brushing her tangled hair. Diesel lifted his head instantly. "You heard that too?" she whispered. A thud, soft, muffled, from the front porch. She swung her legs out of bed, pulled on her boots, grabbed her flashlight. Diesel followed her through the hallway, silent as a shadow. The door creaked open. Rain blew sideways across the steps. Nothing. Then she saw it. A folded piece of paper, held down with a pine cone. Rachel bent, picked it up and wiped the water from the ink. The handwriting was sharp, almost carved. They weren't working alone. By morning the rain had stopped, but a thick fog clung to the lower trails like wool. Rachel met Frank outside the station. The note was sealed in a plastic evidence bag, and she passed it to him without a word. "Dropped sometime after midnight," she said. "No footprints, nothing on the cameras." Frank examined the writing. "Same pencil as before. Could be the kid again." Rachel nodded. "Mason." "He knows something else," Frank muttered. "Or someone does." They drove to the Whitaker house just after breakfast. Clara answered the door in her housecoat, tea steaming in her hand. She didn't ask why they were there. "I knew you'd come," she said, stepping aside. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Mason home?" "In his room. But you should hear this first." The house smelled like cinnamon and cedar. A quilt lay folded on the couch. A photograph of Clara's daughter, Mason's mother, hung above the mantel. "He had a dream," Clara said. 2 nights ago. Woke up crying. Said Diesel was in trouble again. When I asked more, he went quiet. Drew something. I think he left it for you." Rachel looked to Frank, who just nodded. In the boys' room, Diesel lay curled beside Mason's bed. The boy sat up as they entered. "They're still out there," Mason said. "Who?" Rachel asked. "Not just the ones you caught, others. They have a cabin. I saw it." "You saw it?" Frank asked. "In my head," Mason said plainly. Then he pulled a drawing from his nightstand and handed it to Rachel. It showed tall trees, a dark wooden structure, and a narrow bridge over a creek. At the bottom, in uneven letters, were the words, "Diesel knows." Rachel didn't argue. She didn't need to, because Diesel had never been wrong, and Mason, somehow, had never been far behind. They geared up that afternoon with the weight of knowing. Not assumptions, not suspicions, knowing. Rachel didn't brief the full department. No press, no calls to county. Just her, Frank, and Diesel. She'd learned that the more people you brought, the less the forest gave. It quieted, it recoiled. And this wasn't a mission for noise. The sketch Mason had drawn was folded and tucked into her chest pocket. Crayon lines, uneven but exact. A ridge, a creek, a cabin. He had drawn it with the same precision he had drawn the first one. But this one had something else, a bridge. They hiked east of the ridge, past the old fire line, deeper than the search teams had gone the week before. The land there had changed. The trails were narrower, tree roots twisted over the ground like veins, moss blanketed everything. The forest was older. It had a memory. Rachel led, Diesel at her side, Frank a few steps behind. No one spoke. Even the birds stayed silent. The higher they climbed, the colder the air became. Not from elevation, from stillness. Diesel stopped once, paw lifted, ears forward. He sniffed, then moved again, more alert now. His head lowered. Tracking something. Rachel felt her pace adjust without thinking. She trusted him more than any compass. They reached the creek by late afternoon. It ran slow beneath a wooden bridge, narrow, bowed with age. Rachel crouched, ran her fingers over the planks. They were damp, worn, but something was wrong. The grain was fresh in spots, reinforced. Frank checked the supports. "Recently nailed. See here?" He tapped a mark in the wood. "Someone's been maintaining this, hiding it in plain sight." Rachel stood and pointed past the bridge. There, half concealed behind a thicket of spruce trees, sat a cabin. Unmarked. No address, no path, no power lines, just a box of dark wood hunched into the hill. "Bingo," Frank muttered. They circled wide, coming in from the rear. Rachel moved like water, flowing between trees, sidearm drawn. Diesel crouched beside her, ears twitching. She could see smoke curling from the chimney. Someone was home. She motioned to a side window, peered inside. 3 men, one stirring something on a stove, one seated at a table, scribbling on a map, the third cleaning a bolt-action rifle. In the corner, crates. Wooden, metal, stacked. One moved. Rachel's pulse jumped. They had more animals. She turned to Frank. "We call it in. Quietly, no mistakes." Frank nodded, reached for his radio. Then, a floorboard creaked inside the cabin. Diesel growled. Low, deep. The man at the table turned toward the window, saw them. "Go!" Rachel shouted. Chaos erupted. One suspect bolted through the front door, tearing into the woods. Frank gave chase. The other 2 scrambled, knocking over the table, one reaching for a crowbar, the other a hunting knife. Rachel moved first, kicked the side door in. "Sheriff's Department! Hands where I can see!" The one with the knife lunged. Diesel was faster. He launched forward, intercepting the man mid-step, teeth bared. The man dropped the weapon and stumbled back. Diesel herded him to the corner, body low, tail rigid. The second man froze, arms raised. The sound of Frank returning, panting, dragging the third suspect in cuffs. Rachel stepped over splintered wood, heart hammering, and knelt by the crate. Slowly, she lifted the latch. Inside, eyes wide, fur trembling, was a fox kit. Tiny, no older than a few weeks. Its muzzle was scraped, one paw wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. "It's alive," she said, voice low. By sunset, the area was swarming. Fish and wildlife officers, a state biologist, and 3 patrol vehicles lined the slope. Evidence bags, photographs, statements. Rachel sat on the back bumper of her cruiser, arms smeared with dried blood, knuckles scraped. Diesel beside her, tongue out, breathing slow. "You're tired," she said softly, "but not done yet." Frank approached with a bottle of water. "You good?" Rachel took it, unscrewed the cap, drank. "I am now." The next morning, the Cedar Falls Gazette ran a front-page headline, "Senior K9 uncovers second poacher camp." There was a photo of Diesel taken just after the bust, head held high, Rachel's hand resting on his back. Kids brought posters to the sheriff's office. Someone dropped off a hand-carved wooden plaque that read, Deputy Diesel, Guardian of the Falls. A local artist painted a portrait. It hung above Rachel's desk by noon. But the change wasn't just outside. Rachel felt it in her spine, in the way the town looked at her, not with expectation anymore, but with respect. They hadn't just come to believe in her. They believed in him. Later that evening, she stood on her porch with a cup of black coffee. Diesel lay at her feet, the sky glowing orange above the trees. The town was quiet, still. Her badge sat heavy in her jacket pocket, the new one, the one she felt she'd finally earned. She reached down and scratched behind Diesel's ear. You changed everything, you know that? He didn't lift his head. He just leaned in, pressing into her boot. She smiled. I thought I came here to forget, but maybe I came here to remember. Thanksgiving arrived on the tail end of a windstorm. Power flickered out for nearly 2 days, but no one complained. The volunteer fire department served hot meals at the community centre. Blankets were donated. Folding chairs lined every wall. Diesel stayed under Rachel's table the whole time, watching every moving plate like it might require guarding. Mason sat beside him, hand resting on his paw, eyes quiet. Rachel caught Clara watching from across the room. The old woman raised her tea mug in a silent toast. Rachel returned it with a nod. Winter deepened. Snow fell hard and fast. The trails froze. The poachers stopped coming, at least for a while. Rachel built something she hadn't had in years, routine. She and Diesel walked the perimeter trail every morning, snow or not. They stopped by the school on Wednesdays to see Mason's class. Once a week, they delivered supplies to the wildlife centre. The cubs, both rescued, were growing, stronger every day. Diesel never chased, never barked. He stayed close. One Sunday, Rachel woke to find him standing at the front door, tail still, eyes fixed on the woods. She didn't ask. She dressed, pulled on her boots and followed. They passed the creek, the bridge, the tree where he had once untied her from death. Eventually they reached a ridge high above Cedar Falls. The town below, dusted in white, looked like something from a dream. Diesel sat. Rachel joined him. She rested her hand on his back, and for a long time, neither of them moved. The snow came early that year. By the second week of November, the ridge lines above Cedar Falls had already turned white. Frost crept across windows in swirling lace. Children bundled into oversized jackets. Fireplace smoke curled from chimneys, blurring the line between roofs and clouds. Inside a timber-framed home surrounded by wind-bent cedars, Rachel stood at the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around a chipped mug. Behind her, Diesel lay on his thick plaid blanket near the heater. His breathing was slower now, deeper, with pauses between each rise and fall. When he stood too fast, his back leg would tremble. His eyes had dulled just a little. The vet had warned her, arthritis, hip stiffness, old tendon injuries, especially in cold weather. Diesel didn't complain. He never had. He still rose with her every morning, still padded behind her from room to room, still waited by the front door like the day didn't begin until they stepped outside together, and she still followed. Over the last few months, they had been through fire, an ambush, 2 separate rescue operations, a full wildlife trafficking investigation that ended with 3 men facing federal charges. Rachel had thought justice would be the thing that settled her. It wasn't. It was the way the town changed. It was the way they looked at Diesel, not as a relic, as a legend. People who once questioned Rachel's badge now nodded with respect. Local reporters ran features about the retired canine who never really retired. Kids drew pictures. The hardware store owner carved a wooden nameplate for the sheriff's porch. Diesel, still watching. Dr. Miriam had insisted Diesel receive an official badge, polished brass, real weight, etched with the words, Deputy K9 Diesel, Cedar Falls, WA. He wore it once at the town hall ceremony. Rachel hadn't planned to speak, but when she stood on the stage with Diesel beside her and looked out, veterans, teachers, farmers, kids, even former skeptics, she realized they hadn't just come for her. They came for him. That night, Rachel sat on the porch as the moon rose. Diesel lay with his head on her foot, his body curled into a tight, familiar shape. She reached down, brushing her fingers behind his ear. You gave them something to believe in, she whispered. You gave me something to hold on to. He didn't move, only leaned slightly into her hand. I thought I came here to forget, she murmured, voice barely above the wind. But maybe I came here to remember. When Thanksgiving arrived, it brought a windstorm that knocked out power across half the county. No one seemed to mind. The fire department opened the community centre. Locals donated hot meals and old quilts. Diesel curled under Rachel's table the entire day, calm and unbothered, like the whole town was just another room in the house he protected. Mason sat beside him again, fingers twined in thick fur. The boy didn't speak much, but he didn't need to. The way he looked at Diesel said everything. Across the room, Clara Whitaker watched with that same silent knowing. When Rachel caught her eye, the old woman lifted her tea in quiet acknowledgement. Rachel nodded back. As winter deepened, life found rhythm. Rachel and Diesel resumed their weekly school visits. They delivered supplies to the rehab centre where the bear cubs now thrived, strong, healthy, ready for spring release. Diesel never lagged, never strayed. Even when his hips stiffened, he kept pace, eyes scanning, ears alert. He never chased squirrels, never barked without cause. He simply stayed close. One Sunday morning, Rachel woke to find him standing at the front door again, eyes fixed on the snow-coated woods. No sound, no movement, just stillness. She didn't ask. She put on her coat, laced her boots, and followed him out. They walked in silence past the creek, past the bridge, past the old pine where he had waited years ago. They climbed the ridge where the town unfolded beneath them. Diesel sat. Rachel joined him. The sky was pale, the trees dusted with white. She rested a hand on his back, and he leaned into her like always. They stayed like that for nearly an hour. By Christmas, the K9 unit was officially restored on paper. Diesel wasn't on the active roster, but he trained the new dogs anyway. 2 recruits, one a wiry black lab named Ranger, the other a golden shepherd named Tess, looked to him like he was myth. When Ranger got distracted during a tracking exercise, Diesel stepped in, not with aggression, not with bark, but with presence. He stood in front of the pup, stared him down until the younger dog returned to task. Rachel laughed from the sidelines. He doesn't train with treats, he trains with disappointment. It worked. On New Year's Eve, they walked down to the lakefront bonfire together. The whole town had gathered, fireworks packed into cardboard boxes, music playing from a small speaker looped through an old generator. When the sky lit up, Diesel didn't flinch, not once. He sat beside Rachel, head high, ears relaxed, watching the crowd. She looked down at him. I guess we're both not running anymore, she said. The last Sunday in January came like any other. Rachel walked in from patrol, kicked off her boots, hung her jacket. Her keys clattered onto the kitchen table. Come on, old man, she called over her shoulder. Dinner's on. But Diesel didn't follow. He lay in his bed near the fireplace, curled tight, eyes closed. She walked over, knelt beside him, rested a hand on his chest. Still rising, still falling, but slower, more distant. She didn't cry, didn't call the vet. She just lay down beside him on the floor, one arm draped gently over his shoulders, her breath sinking with his. The sun disappeared behind the trees, and sometime before dawn, Diesel passed, no sound, no struggle, just stillness. Rachel buried him the next morning under the old pine near the trailhead, the same place he had waited for her, the same path he had taken to bring her home. The town came. Frank arrived in full uniform, his face solemn, his hands clutching Diesel's badge. He placed it gently against the wooden marker. Mason painted a river stone with Diesel's name in blue and tucked it beneath the roots. Clara laid a sprig of lavender. Rachel sat on the bench the community had built beside the grave. She didn't speak, just listened, to the wind in the trees, to the hush of the earth breathing. Weeks later, she finished her final entry in the journal she had started the day Diesel returned. The ink bled slightly on the page, but her hand didn't shake. Some dogs are meant to stay, not just in our homes, but in our bones. Some return to save us. Others remind us we were never truly lost. Diesel was both. Not every hero has a voice. Some just leave a trail strong enough to follow. She closed the book and placed it on the shelf. Then she stepped outside into the quiet morning. The woods whispered like they always had. But this time, she wasn't afraid to listen.